Hello, welcome back to the channel. This is a bit of an old school video. I'm not going to be using my notes as well. I have notes and not an actual script. I'm also wearing my glasses because I forgot how I was downloading these onto my tablet, and it's kind of a tiny one. So, time to actually use my glasses. Uh, yeah. If you want to help us out, we have a GoFundMe. We also have Patreon, and I make stuff, which we're actually going to be going over some of that today. I figure with a lot of the recent research I've been doing, which I've been posting up on Facebook, a little bit here and there on YouTube, I figured we should do like an in-depth dive into the sorts of hats and caps that pirates, sailors, the general working class would have been wearing in England in the late 17th century. I can't decide if I like these or not. You know what? I can see just fine without them, I think. They're kind of annoying. That was one of the things, like when I was in the army, I could not qualify with my glasses to save my life. I had to take off the glasses. They had little attachments in the eye pro so that you could like have your prescription in there, and you no, you don't care about that. So let's just get right into this. Pirates wore cocked hats of various sorts. Have an awesome day. End. Okay, now it's not that simple. A few months back, short on fabric, I decided to do some research on caps in the 17th century. This is research I'd been working on for a while, but not having enough fabric to do jackets and things like that. I was like, you know what? Let's do a deep dive into this, see if we can figure out some new things. I was making progress on this research, and then out of nowhere, I got an awesome message from Piotr, who's a longtime follower of both YouTube and Facebook. Uh, he had found an English deck of cards dated 1702 and thought I'd be interested. And I mean, of course I was. He kind of filled in a lot of the pieces that a lot of us who've been studying this knew were missing. We just never knew how much was missing. As I have said in prior videos, images of English working class and sailors during the golden age of piracy are very rare before Hogarth in about 1725. Much of what we have comes from Dutch artists, written accounts, a few wealthier artifacts, some bog finds, and frankly, a lot of guesswork. Oh, future me. Kind of skipped like a very important point here. So, another big problem with the research is we don't, a lot of times, even today, we don't write down like our normal things that we take for granted. So, in some of the court documents, you'll see a cap. What sort of cap you talking about? If I wrote down in a diary, "Oh, I put my hat on this morning," I might not even be referring to a blocked hat. I'm probably referring to my baseball cap. A shirt. Normally, I'm wearing a black t-shirt. Today, I'm wearing a camouflage t-shirt. If you just put camouflage shirt, that could be any number of things. You also need to think about if you're spending a large amount of money to have a picture commissioned, a portrait, are you going to be wearing like your day to day in the street clothing, or are you going to be trying to wear your fancier stuff? And again, if you are an artist, what are you going to be depicting? Actually, what's very interesting about that, about this Hogarth image, which I'm going to get into in the future past, however this is working here, because again, this is future me while editing. The Hogarth image, he has a cap, and then for the final print, he switched it to a blocked hat. Why? Why Hogarth? Didn't even make a note of it. Like, oh, I just Didn't like the composition. I think that's about. I think that's good. Okay, carry on past me. There was not a lot of working class art, especially on the English side of things. You see genre paintings in the Low Countries, so think Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Germany, well, Germany for a big portion of it, France, you'll see some of it, but you don't see the same thing in England. Most of the art is upper class. Now, that is not to say there were not paintings and drawings and things of lower classes. There probably are. They're probably just not cataloged that well. They might not have survived in that great of condition. The whole era between 1690 and 1725, the era which encompasses the pirate round, the pirates of Nassau, it tends to have very little solid information, again, on the English side of things. As many have pointed out, the engravings from the general history of pirates are what Dutch sailors would have been wearing, not English ones. Gotta keep in mind, those engravings are Dutch. They are not English. Even though it's an English author writing an English book, the engravings are from the Netherlands. Although some date to the 1720s, most of them are in fact later. So we don't even have a good picture of the Dutch if we're talking about that book in particular. Some of the features, though, are accurate if you know what you're looking for. Now, let's get back to these playing cards because they're something special. They were published by Thomas Tuttle. He was a royal mathematical instrument maker who died in 1702. So literally, these were like one of the last things he approved of. He drowned while surveying. These would have been essentially like marketing. His address in 1695 was against the Royal Exchange in Cornhill. Like he was in the center of the action. Again, he was the royal mathematical instrument maker. John Savage was the engraver. He died in 1701. The reason I'm bringing this up is we need to figure out just exactly when these were created. The artist for the cards, the one who did the drawings, which were then engraved by John Savage, was Francois Boutard. He was a French artist who was living in London. Most of the art was most likely created in the mid to late 1690s. With Savage dying in 1701, the engraving couldn't have been done any later, and this was a full deck of cards on top of Savage's other projects. For instance, he's the engraver for some of the 1688 Cries of London, which I also use as research points. Now, the question is, as a French artist, would these have been accurate for the English? This is something when you are doing any sort of research, you need to ask yourself, what's the intent? What's this person's experience? Is this like solid information or is this propaganda? Given the politics of the time, keep in mind France was the bad guy at this era of history, especially when it came to England. And this was Tuttle, who was a royal instrument maker. The images almost definitely would reflect an English aesthetic. So Francois Boutard, both him and his son worked in London, and Francois later died in Amsterdam. Given his movement within English and Dutch territory during the 9 Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession, you gotta keep in mind this is before photography. So if you have a really good artist floating around that's from an enemy nation, they might be spying. Now, I don't think Francois was doing that. He seems to have been respected by the English and the Dutch. I could not find if he was Protestant, because that could have explained why, although he was French, he was allowed free movement. So, could he have been a Huguenot? I do not know. I couldn't find much on his son when it came to religion either. So, it's up in the air. I need to make a note on words. I will be saying slop every now and then. That is not a reference to AI. It's not a reference to overbreaches. That is a reference to ready-made clothing, which was popular in the time. Slop shops exploded as a result of the wars in the late 17th century, and you could often find them at port cities. They would be an alternative to tailors or having somebody in your family or yourself make your clothes. They were seen as kind of like bottom of the barrel. Not quite as bottom as secondhand stuff, but still kind of low. They were working class clothing. In the case of the navies, it was a way for them to supply their ships. So they would go to whoever they had contracted out to make the slops. They'd be rolled into bundles, put into barrels, and they would have been stored on the ship. And it would come out of your pay. It's very important when we're talking about sailors of this time period, whether they be Navy or pirates, to recognize what sorts of clothing would be available. And the slops give us a really good idea. That's not to say you wouldn't bring stuff from home. That's always, that's like what was expected. But by the end of the trip, you'd probably have slops. And that means literally everything down to your shoes would be in that contract. When I say slops, I'm not talking about pants. I see reenactors, people who've been reenacting for years, make that mistake. Oh, you're wearing slops. I'm wearing petticoat breeches. I'm not wearing slops. Now, this hat's a slop. What? Before Piotr sent me these cards, we had only 3 known images of English sailors that were definitely English sailors and were from an English source. They were from the 1690s, and it's a frontispiece, which would have been, it was on the front of a English Navy document. And it depicted 2 sailors wearing check petticoat breeches and holding navigational instruments. Then there's another, I believe it came from a gunnery manual of a gunner wearing a longer waistcoat. Now the thing is, all 3 of these were wearing what the Polish know as a copack. One of these, a fur hat with like a little split in the front. Hoping it's clear. I mean, I'm going to put pictures up so you obviously will get the depiction of this. Now, this one is not lined. The first one I ever made was lined, and I realized in Pennsylvania weather, it was a little too warm. This is a nice balance. I mean, if I have to pull a little bit of the fur down, cover my ears a little bit if it's too cold, I mean, it still works. There was a lot of clothing exchange during the 30 Years' War, and a lot of it was going from east to west. You start to see, really early on, you start to see the copack as a style of hat, first in Germany, then the Netherlands, and then England. They remain into the 18th century. Just found one a few weeks ago where it didn't have fur, it had the lining fabric on the outside. It just one of this, it was so ugly, I just had to make it. Somebody bought it because, hey, gotta respect an ugly hat, especially if it's historical. We do have a surviving example of a copack. Now, this was found on the German smuggling ship, the Archangel Raphael. It sank in 1724 in the Gulf of Finland. Made out of wool. The outside here is sheepskin. The lining is lynx, which I had to go look on eBay to see what the prices of lynx was going. I don't know if I can justify it. Now, were they all made this way? No. We know for a fact different furs were used. Were they lined with fur? Probably not all the time. I mean, that example I said that I found that was later in the Netherlands didn't even have fur. So, but this is a great example where we have the surviving artifact. So we know roughly how they were made in general. But here's the kicker on this whole thing. There is no reference to these hats in either the 1690 or the 1706 slop contract. Nothing. There's no fur hat reference. So these were almost certainly private purchase, and the fact they appear, I mean, twice, but on 3 different people, were they popular? Obviously, they were popular enough to end up on official documents. Now, would they have been worn in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean? Probably not. But you gotta remember, there were pirates operating in the North Atlantic. There would have been privateers operating in the North Atlantic. So, and if you're somebody doing a civilian impression, it's a hat to look into, especially if you're in a colder environment. A lot of this discussion began with the Montero cap. One appears in the 1688 Cries of London. It's a secondhand clothing salesman, and he's holding it in his hand. Out. Somebody had mentioned it before when I was doing the early stages of my investigation. I didn't really think anything of it. I kind of blew it off. I decided to look at it again. This one has a bit of a pentagon shape to the brim, and he's holding it like this. If you look at the cards, there's at least one guy who appears to have a hat with the visor up and something going on behind it. There's actually quite a few that have visors up. We're going to get into that. Montero's, on the English side of things, originated in Spain and became popular with hunters and eventually soldiers. And after that, they're referenced even into the 18th century as being popular with sailors and fishermen. When you look at French sources, they'll reference what's called a bonnet d'Anglais. And I know I just completely butchered that. I apologize. But an English hat, or an English cap, rather. In German sources, I'm not even going to try the German, but again, it's an English cap. And all of them say it's popular with fishermen and sailors. So, a little bit on the Montero. When I first made this hat, I realized I've made this hat before. Back in the day of doing Spanish Civil War stuff, this is the pasamontañas. This exact hat never went away. Button and all, never went away in Spain. There's an issue with this hat. Now, it does appear, 1688, it appears. Earlier, it appears. You can wear it visor down, you can wear it visor up, whatever you want to do. One of the things people found was a image from the 1630s of a buccaneer attack on one of the islands in the Caribbean. They're wearing a very similar hat to this. Now, could it be this style of buccaneer hat? It's tough to say, but given that it's lacking the back portion and this part's flat, or even appears to be drooping down, I'm more inclined to think it is a Montero. Would you have worn one of these in the Caribbean? If you take this part off, let's talk a little bit about that part too. So I mentioned the French. The French kept that hat style going, and they developed it into what's called the tapaboard. This, now I've seen several different variations on how they would attach the brim. This one I decided just to attach it to one of the buttons for that. There, tapaboard. The images I've seen all seem to have like a much wider visor, much longer visor. But again, it looks kind of consistent with some of the Buccaneer images. And they also decided, the cape's kind of stupid. What if we make it separated so we can wear it different ways? When doing research, another good tip. If you can't find something from your specific era, try to find its ancestor or try to find what it evolved into. When I was first looking at this, I was not looking at the Montero. I was looking at what's referred to as a waterman's cap or a barge cap, which is when I did the 1706 flop contract leather cap, this is how I ended up with this. It's based on several examples that we do have pictures of that were worn later in the time period. I don't want to get too ahead of myself though, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So, in the 1690 slop contract, there is a reference to a red cap. Keep in mind, there is also a reference to specifically a Monmouth cap. The Monmouth cap, which I sadly do not have an example of, is a knit cap. They have been around since at least the 16th century, possibly before. They feature a little button on the top and usually a loop. There's different reasons for why it has the loop in the button. It's a very specific English style of cap. They've changed very little even into present. They're a very convenient hat. I actually just commissioned somebody to make me one, so hopefully if I do a follow-up video to this, right here's a Monmouth cap. I mean, I'm having pictures, hopefully. We know what they look like. And one of the big theories on some of the random caps that are mentioned, oh, maybe it's a mammoth cap. Well, no, it's not because that's right there. They do appear in the card deck. What's also interesting is we also see some of the Dutch style caps in an English context. When I say Dutch style caps, I'm talking about the ones that look like hats, but they're knitted, like a blocked hat, but instead they're knitted. Uh, Peter the Great caps, I've heard them referred to as. Peter the Great's actually looks like Luffy's from One Piece, even though his is straw. Recently, W.M. Booth Draper actually posted one of these Dutch caps that was found in New York that dates to about the 1750s. So these were still popular. And they're a good hat because you've got all the benefits of a blocked hat, but it's tighter fitting to your head, so it's not going to blow off. And you can move it around a lot more. They also varied in height. So you'll notice some that are kind of tall, but you'll also notice ones that are about the same size as the mammoth cap, and they appear in the same time period together. It's not, yeah, probably the taller ones were earlier, but there's still some hats in that time earlier that were like, oh, that kind of looks like the lower style too. So I think of a lot of it was personal preference. The other knit styles of time were such things, what we call like a whaler hat. And within the card deck, there's also some caps that they look like a combination, which the mammoth cap I'm getting, I've requested to be just slightly longer than a normal, well, slightly taller than a usual one. Those are not what the red caps were. So if you start looking at some of the images of the Buccaneers in the time period, when I say that, I'm talking about the ones that were not made by eyewitnesses. When you look at some of the barge caps or riverman caps or waterman caps, you start to notice a pattern. If you look at what's referred to in Scandinavia as a carpus, you start getting a little bit closer to what these hats most likely looked like. Well, the card deck shows something very interesting. At least one of the images shows two very similar but slightly different caps. And there's another one that shows one of these caps again, and we also have a similar cap from another engraving, which we all seem to think it's late 17th century, so right in the time period. But it's a cap that looks like this. The ear flaps actually do hold up a lot better if you're wearing the hat. There's no evidence that these were tied on. So I've been experimenting with different ways. Can I get, yeah, there, close enough. At least one image, it almost looks like they're rolled. Another image, they're just standing upright. And again, there's no evidence of buttons or ties. So how practical would it be? Who knows? But there's also a version without those, and it appears in one of the same images. And the best part is, they're sailors. So if you notice, it's got a small visor. It's very different than, in that regard, it's very different than the later barge or waterman caps. There's one that I found from a Hogarth where there's no practical way that visor would have worked on a sewn hat. Which, when I made my example of it, I actually permanently attached the visor to the shell of the hat. Now, I will make a slight note for the Revolutionary War reenactors. Check your patterns, because one of the images that I found that is cited for the Revolutionary War style forage caps, you can notice at least two seams in the image, meaning it's most likely a four-panel hat, which gets into the evolution of this thing. With four-panel hats, you have a very long history. This is one of the earliest hat styles. Like, I'm pretty sure they date back to the Neolithic. And it's just a very simple construction. You take four triangular shaped panels, sew them together, boom, you got something that fits your head. Note the button though. I really think, in my personal view, based on what I see going from the Montero, what the Montero was used for, to these hats, I think these were more of a simplified Montero. Because in the case of like the full on, it's got ear flaps, they kept the ear flaps, got rid of the ski mask thing going on, and then kept the visor. Now, is this what the red cap is? I think yes. And in the same spot in the 1706 slop contract is where we get the reference to the leather caps. The 1706 slop contract says leather caps faced with red cotton. Cotton in this case being a lighter weight wool. So something that you would use for a lining or facing material. And lined with black linen at the rate of 1 shilling and 2 pence each. And then right below that entry, they have small leather caps stitched with white thread at the rate of 8 pence each. Now, the reason I went with this shape was based on some of the Buccaneer images. If I did this over again, I'm not sure because some of you think about the Hogarth that I just mentioned and probably put a picture up for, as well as some of the other barge caps and waterman caps. Heading into the 18th century and pretty much like until the 19th century, yeah, this flap became pretty much useless. So, yeah, I think having this as the facing, to me it makes sense. It's not as practical as the wool ones. That said, there's a lot of references to leather caps being worn by fishermen, sailors, etc. We see these evolve into basically a naval helmet or a marine helmet in the later 18th century. I was talking with a friend of mine, and they're like, it's almost like a jockey helmet too. Which, if you look at some of the early jockey helmets, they follow a very similar pattern to these, to be more specific. But what was really interesting is when I started. I'm not a big fan of AI, as I hope a lot of you realize, but I decided to use Google's AI to do some searching, and it came up with rugby hats, which is very interesting. Rugby hats eventually evolved into these. But let's get back to that leather hat real quick because notice I'm saying hats. In an early part of my research, somebody mentioned about the wreck of the Stirling Castle from 1703. English ship, so right up my alley, right in the time period. Like the cards that were published would have only been published the year before. I bet there's some like this is the slop contract right here. This is it. We're gonna find some like finally a definitive answer to what we're looking for. They found two hats. They are made out of leather hats. Keep that in mind, not a sewn cap or a knitted cap, but a hat made out of leather, and they were laced at the back. If you walked into a reenactment wearing one of these hats, even now, I'd probably look at you and be like, "You going for the steampunk thing or something?" No, they're real. They existed. They are 100% not the cap being referenced because there is a distinction in the language between a cap and a hat. What's their reasoning? We don't know. And because they look so much like a blocked hat, it's really tough to even judge artwork unless there's a really detailed painting that shows up that shows the stitching or sketch that shows the stitching. It's really tough to tell what context these fit into. Obviously, a naval context because they were on a ship, but even that could have been a trade item. Could have been something somebody brought from home. It's one of these difficult things when dealing with artifacts, especially if we don't have written material to go with them. If we didn't know what a Montero roughly looked like, we didn't get descriptions from other countries and things, we would probably think those were Monteros. If we didn't see the lineage of the leather hat and the leather cap and how it progressed, we'd initially think those were it. So for those of you who enjoy archaeology, there's a mystery for you. What were those caps doing? My money is on a time traveling steampunk person. That's just future me popping in here. So the four panel hats, they do appear throughout the 17th century without anything extra going on. And they also appear in into the 18th century. So keep in mind, these are not the linen caps that some of the sutlers sell. These are most likely wool. And they're just a basic working class cap. You could have made them out of secondhand clothing. You didn't necessarily need to have these, wouldn't necessarily be the best made thing. But of note on that is, so another style that pops up in these images is, now it appears to have 6 panels. This is another possibility on the red cap. It could just be another variation. I don't really see these on sailors. I see these on normal workers. At first, I thought they were basically just a normal 4 panel cap, possibly a 6 panel cap. But I noticed there was something interesting going on in the front. And then in one of the images of a shipbuilder, you see what's going on in the front. I don't know if this was its own unique thing or if somebody got a little creative and just combined the flaps and the visor together. Who knows? But the visor does seem to have been a very popular thing in these images. And I should note there's also what looks to be a Montero without the cape going on. So this card deck, there's still a lot more research to be done. This is not the end all be all, but it finally gives us a really good start on where to look and also at like what were some of the common trends. And again, this having a visor seems to be what a lot of these workers were going for. Workers and sailors, rather. Another cap which appears. Now, I'm not sure where the bag caps begin. I mentioned 4 panel caps being very old. The bag cap, given that it's very tough to tell in some of the images if it's somebody with just something wrapped around their head or if it's one of these, it's tough to tell. A lot of the surviving examples are upper class and would have been worn as a lounge cap. But again, they do appear in images of workers. There's some that are very definitely one of these. Notice it's literally the same style cap. One's just tied off, the other one has a nice little sewn area instead. Would sailors have worn these? There's seems to be indication that yeah, these could have been worn. They're definitely a lot lighter weight than some of these other hats and caps, but they're not as practical when it comes to like having a visor, having ear flaps, things like that. So for their weight, yeah, you probably see people walking around, especially in warmer weather, hats like this, people doing jobs that are a lot more intensive. Well, not even intensive. There's like the wealthy wore these as lounge caps, but you see a lot of these caps with people that are doing very intensive jobs. Same thing with like when I was talking about the mules, the shoes. Like you'll see blacksmiths wearing mules, carpenters wearing mules even. And they're also wearing this cap. Meanwhile, you'll see the wealthy wearing mules to relax. Hey, it's future me again. Actually, much more future me. I'm probably dressed similar to this right now, watching this on YouTube, just FYI. When I'm mentioning blocked hats right now. I'm mentioning the Buccaneer hats. I need to also note some of these cap styles could have been made in a blocked form. There's actually a 1695 image of a Buccaneer. Again, probably not from somebody who witnessed Buccaneers, where there's a blocked hat that looks very similar to some of the worker caps that I mentioned earlier. Uh, I think that was also Future Me who mentioned those. So we do see blocked hats being made in the same style as some of the caps, which makes things even more confusing. Uh, there's also a tapaboard, the French style of Montero from Sweden, of all places. That's a blocked hat. Matthew Brinkle, he does some amazing hats. He actually did a reproduction of that Swedish example. Definitely something to check out. One of the big things that we get into in later 18th century debates over some of these cap styles, some of them appear to be blocked. And very likely they would have been. There's also shaped leather. There's actually a wreck find of a helmet that was shaped leather, which, when talking about this style of cap, there's some debate over if this would have been in pieces. I mean, it does say it was stitched, but hey, historians like to debate each other. There is some debate over whether this would have actually been formed leather. The and also of note, I don't know if it's going to be in here or if it's going to be in another part of this video. The modern day company of Waterman and Lighterman in London, descendants of the Waterman that we've been talking about, Lighterman referring to a flat bottom barge, by the way, they wear red caps. Very similar to the styles that I just went over. I just found out about them the other day. I don't think they I don't think they use the original pattern, but it's a very similar style of cap. The other style they wear is a blocked form. Is a lot larger, more in the scale with what we see in the images, but it's a blocked hat and they have their visor, peak, brim, whatever you want to call it. It's actually flat and extends out. So there's still a tradition of these hats, which I think is just awesome. So, oh, let you all get back to the video. Catch you later. We didn't need to make this a complete video and not just on, oh, you're researching on caps. So in the 1680s, we got the French cartographers again. I try to treat the Buccaneers separately for a lot of these videos, but as many of you realize, when I did the research on the Red Sea pirates, quite a few of them were Buccaneers. Quite a few of them had, that's how they started their career, were as Buccaneers, and the 9 Years' War happened. They became privateers and eventually became pirates again. So this is a style of hat that appears in those engravings. It would have been a blocked hat, wool felt, beaver felt, who knows, some sort of felt. I used a little bit of hemp for a slight flourish on it. How would they have kept their shape? Lacquer was very early starting to be used, like it was the early stages of being used for hats. Could have used wax, could have used animal fats, who knows? But yeah, this is the Buccaneer hat. Would pirates who were formerly buccaneers and then privateers worn hats like this? I think there's a pretty good chance that people in, let's say, with that were with Thomas too, Bachelor's Delight, yeah, they would have been wearing a hat like this. It's 1680s in the 90s. This is the early part of the 90s. Yeah, I don't see these hats going away. And given what we've looked at with some of the caps, could there be a connection in the styles? Yeah, I think so. And it's a practical cap. It's a practical hat. You don't have a lot of that brim getting in the way. It does its job. It keeps the sun out of your eyes. And it's kind of got the rule of cool. I mean, for the time period. I mean, I got my headphones on, so it even looks more goofy. It kind of has a cartoon kind of look to it today, but in the past, I can see it being cool. And of course, we have multiple forms of just regular blocked hats, and these do appear in images. They were not a slop contract item. Now, a lot of the images that we have, again, show upper class people. We do have a few military images from the time period, and they show a variety of different styles. The upper class, they tend to be a little bit more uniform, I realize. I wrongly encourage, and this is no matter your time period, be very careful of using upper class images if you're doing a working class impression. A lot of stuff would have been hand-me-downs, and a lot of your stuff would have been modified to make your job easier. A rich person who's just walking around all day, yeah, they might have feathers all around their glorious blocked hat. Would you? Would they be practical for you? Probably not. If you're a pirate, yeah, you could steal it. But would that be what you'd wear while you were on the ship, while you were doing jobs? This is where a lot of these caps come into play. And one thing to pay attention to with the art, which I mentioned earlier, is There are a few paintings of sea battles from 17th, 18th century. Look at how the people are dressed. A lot of those came from artist studios. Don't expect your artist who is used to doing commissions for wealthy clients to be familiar with the ins and outs of naval conflict. You might see a stormy sea and people are wearing, everything's great, guys. And these would blow off in a heartbeat. But again, if you're a pirate and you're going on shore and you want to look your best, yeah, that hat that you stole from that brig a few weeks ago, perfect hat. Let's go with that. If you are trying to keep the sun out of your eyes on your pirate ship and frankly, you just kind of like felt hats, having some beat up, ugly little thing like this, hey, that'll work. I'd put this on, but this is my son's hat, and his head's a little bit smaller than mine. There are many different crown styles, there are many different brim styles. 1690s, it's a time of transition, so there's a lot going on. You see it with the clothing, you also see it with the headwear. So yeah, I hope some of you that getting into the hobby, you want to have like something different, people that are doing research into this era. I hope I've given you a good start. I want to try to do a lot more videos where I'm teaching you some of the research and how we do some of the research. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, like, comment, share, subscribe. We're almost at 1,000. I'm really hoping by the end of this video we're at 1,000. That would be very nice. I won't get monetized. That's why we have Patreon and GoFundMe. I also make some of this stuff. Quite a few of the hats that I was showing, they are listed up on our Facebook page. Take care. Have an awesome day.